Hi grade twos! So today we're going to be taking some different liquids that I have in my house. I've got some dish soap, some maple syrup, some honey, all these different liquids, and we're going to pour them into this graduated cylinder I have here. It's just a clear tube, and I'm going to observe what happens when I pour them into this tube. Are they going to mix? Are they going to do different things inside? Will they stay together with the different type of liquid that they are? So my first job as a scientist is to make a prediction, and all good scientists write down their prediction. So let's take a moment right now to write a prediction for my experiment today. So like we've talked about in class, a prediction does not need to be exactly what you'll find in the experiment. That's not the point of the prediction. The prediction is just to go into your experiment having some ideas about what you think might happen so that as you're observing, you can sort of check some of your assumptions and hypotheses and find out what really might be happening. So for my prediction for this experiment, I wrote, I think that the corn syrup will be very heavy and sink to the bottom. I predict that the dish soap will be very light and float to the top. So now that I've written down my prediction, I'm ready to do the rest of my experiment. Now that I've written down my prediction, like a good scientific writer that I am, I get to do my experiment. So I'm going to conduct my experiment using these different liquids, and I'm going to add them into my cylinder and observe. And then when the experiment is done, or during the experiment if I want, I can record my observations. That's another important thing that scientists do. So let's start with some honey here. I'm going to put honey into my graduated cylinder, and I don't want to fill it, so I'll just add sort of a small amount right there. And next, I'm adding corn syrup, but corn syrup and honey are sort of close in color. So I'm going to add a bit of food coloring here to my corn syrup. Now I'm ready to add my corn syrup into my graduated cylinder, and I'll observe what happens with the corn syrup there. So far, I'm noticing that the corn syrup and the honey are not mixing. The corn syrup is sitting on top of the honey. Let's add our next liquid. So our next liquid is maple syrup. And this is real maple syrup from Quebec. So I'm not going to add any color. It's a totally different color. I'll add that into my graduated cylinder here. If I look, it is staying on top of that corn syrup there. It's pretty separate from the corn syrup. So the maple syrup is sitting on top. Next, I'm going to go get some milk and add it into my graduated cylinder. If you take a look there, the milk is floating on top of the maple syrup. And again, we've got these pretty clear layers. Now I'm going to add some dish soap. And the dish soap I'm going to add some color to just because it might be hard to tell the difference. So I'm going to make it a different color. Okay, so the dish soap is floating on top of the milk. Next, I'm just going to add some regular old water. And it is a little tricky to see because the water got a bit of food coloring in it. You can tell there's sort of a translucent layer there that's the water, and then there's a layer underneath that is the dish soap. I'll show you close up with the light later to show you that there's really a soap layer and a water layer. And the last liquid we're going to add is canola oil. Let's see what happens to the canola oil. So now you can see we've got the oil, the water, dish soap, milk, maple syrup, corn syrup, and honey, and they're all in different layers here in my graduated cylinder. The last thing we're going to do is add some different objects into my graduated cylinder and see if they all float at the top or what happens to those different objects. So now I've got some different objects right here, and we're going to put these objects into my graduated cylinder. You can see those liquid layers are still separated, and we're going to see where these end up. So first I've got a die here, a screw, a cherry tomato, a popcorn kernel, and a little plastic piece of Lego. So let's put the screw in and see where it ends up. So you guys might have noticed the screw ended up at the bottom in there with the honey. Okay, next let's maybe add my popcorn kernel. We'll add that in now. So I see it right there. And it's sort of settled right by the milk and maple syrup. Okay, now let's do my dye. Oh, so it's sinking below the popcorn kernel. And it's settled sort of between the corn syrup and the maple syrup. So below that popcorn kernel. Now let's do our Lego piece. We'll see where that ends up. See, it might be hard for you guys to see, but it's just sort of sitting there in between the water and the dish soap. Last but not least, we've got our cherry tomato. Let's put that in here. And it's staying pretty close to the top. It's sort of staying in there with the oil. So it's sort of staying right in there with the oil.
Now I'm writing my observations, and observations have to include what I observed. So not every single tiny thing, but all the important things you noticed in the experiment, you need to write down. You can either write those down as you're doing the experiment. It's often easier to remember what you noticed. But sometimes if your experiment's really messy, you can save writing down your observations until the end. So for my observation, I wrote, the liquids from the most dense to least dense were honey, corn syrup, maple syrup, milk, dish soap, water, and canola oil. The objects from most dense to least dense were the screw, dye, popcorn kernel, Lego, and tomato. The more dense materials sunk to the bottom, and the less dense materials floated to the top.
All right, so now I've recorded my observations, which is really important. When you're doing your experiments this week, make sure you record your observations, either during your experiment or when you're done your experiment. And now let's talk a little bit about why I have these different layers. Why do some things go to the bottom of my cylinder, some things float at the top? So let's explore that a bit by taking a look at 3 different liquids from my cylinder. The liquid at the very bottom here was honey. So I've got 3 example liquids. This one is honey, and I'm going to see what its mass is. So these are all the identical amounts. My honey, I took its mass before, my honey has a mass of exactly 40 grams. Okay, so 40 grams for the honey. That was at the bottom. And here I've got the exact same amount of milk. Let's see if its mass is the same. Okay, and what I found before is it has a mass of exactly 30 grams. Okay, so it is less heavy than the honey. And let's look last but not least at my canola oil. And just like before, it has a mass of 25 grams, that same amount. So if I compare those, the honey was the heaviest at 40 grams, and it is at the very bottom here. The oil was the lightest at 25 grams, and it's at the very top. And what we're talking about when we talk about how different liquids and different solids as well have different masses, even though it's the same amount, that's what we call density. So how heavy something is. So if we take the same amount of each liquid and one's heavier, it's more dense. And if something's way lighter than the other liquids at the same volume, it's much less dense. So if something's less dense, it's going to float towards the top. If something's way more dense, it's going to go to the bottom. So I know that the screw I have is more dense than the grape tomato that's close to the top here. And also I know that the screw has the same density as honey, and so does the dye here that's floating right there around the honey. They have the same density. Whereas my Lego piece right here has the same density as this liquid right there. So that's the science explanation behind this experiment. Bye, grade 2s.